Tonight, a man who once wore the uniform of the United States Air Force drew his final breath on a cold steel gurney in Florida. His name was Edward Zakrzewski, a husband, a father, and now, a killer remembered for one of the most horrifying family murders in modern American history.
Welcome to my channel, where true crime stories unfold with every raw, real detail. I'm Mr. Cold Case, your host. To our loyal fans, thanks for coming back. You know we keep it real. If you're new, hit that subscribe button and join our crew of sleuths.
Just hours ago, the state carried out his execution by lethal injection. But behind this ending lies a story that began decades ago. A story of love that turned to control, of fear that turned to obsession, and of a father who believed death was the only way to keep his family together. How does a man sworn to protect his country become the monster his children fear most? And what were his last words before the needle ended his life? This is the full story, from the cracks in his marriage to the blood-stained floor of a Florida home, from a manhunt across the Pacific to the final meal of a condemned killer. Let's begin. Edward Joseph Zakrzewski was born in Michigan in 1962. On the surface, his childhood was ordinary. He wasn't the kid in trouble, the one neighbors whispered about. If anything, he seemed like the kind of young man who would grow up to live a quiet, respectable life. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. As a teenager, Edward sought structure, a sense of purpose. He found it in the United States Air Force. The military gave him order, discipline, and an identity. To those who knew him, he wasn't just a soldier, he was dependable, sharp, the kind of man you'd trust to watch your back. In time, he married a woman named Sylvia. Together, they built what looked like the perfect family: 2 children, Edward Jr. and Anna, a home in Crestview, Florida, and the image of stability. Friends described Edward as quiet, almost reserved. The kind of man who worked hard, loved his kids, and believed in doing things the right way. But pictures lie. Behind the framed smiles on the walls of that Florida home, something was splintering. Edward's marriage to Sylvia wasn't the fairy tale outsiders imagined. They argued, more often, more bitterly. There were whispers of financial strain, bills piling up, and a husband who feared losing control. Divorce became a word that hovered like a storm cloud. And Edward couldn't handle that. To him, divorce wasn't just a breakup, it was humiliation. A personal failure that cut deeper than any wound he'd faced in uniform. Friends didn't see it, but inside Edward's mind, the walls were closing in. He grew paranoid, obsessive, and convinced that if Sylvia left, she'd take the kids, too. By early 1994, the man who once swore to defend his country had declared war on his own family. And he had already decided how it would end. By June of 1994, the Zakrzewski marriage was on life support. Sylvia had reached her breaking point. She wanted out. Out of the fights, out of the fear, out of Edward's tightening grip. Divorce papers were on the horizon, and Edward knew it. For him, that wasn't just a legal document. It was a death sentence for the life he thought he controlled. In his mind, there were only 2 choices: lose everything or take everything. And on June 9, 1994, Edward made his choice. That evening, in their quiet Crestview home, Sylvia was in the kitchen when Edward walked in. But he wasn't there to talk. In his hands was a crowbar, a heavy, cold weapon that said more than words ever could. What happened next would later leave seasoned detectives shaken. Edward swung the crowbar with brutal force, striking his wife again and again until the blows silenced her. But that wasn't enough. Grabbing a knife, he stabbed her repeatedly, making sure there was no life left to take. The noise, the chaos, it didn't go unnoticed. In another room, their son, 7-year-old Edward Jr., must have heard something. His father called for him. Maybe the boy thought it was safe, maybe he trusted the voice that had tucked him into bed 1,000 times before. He walked into the bathroom, and never walked out. Edward killed his son, just as methodically, just as mercilessly. And then, there was Anna. 5 years old. Too young to understand, too innocent to fight. Edward ended her life the same way he had taken the others, cold, deliberate, absolute. 3 lives, gone in minutes. And then came the part that revealed just how calculated it all was. Edward cleaned himself up, wrote a suicide note meant to frame Sylvia as the killer, and left it behind like some grotesque theater. He wanted the world to believe this was her doing, that she snapped, not him. Then he packed a bag, grabbed cash, and walked out of the house where his family lay dead. The father who once promised to protect them was now a fugitive, vanishing into the night with blood on his hands and a plan to disappear forever. After the murders, Edward didn't run blindly. He had a plan, at least, he thought he did. He left Crestview behind, carrying little more than clothes, cash, and the weight of 3 lives he had just taken. His destination? Hawaii. Thousands of miles away, surrounded by water, where he believed no one would ever find him. For weeks, Edward lived like a ghost. He moved quietly, blending in among tourists and locals, hoping the distance would erase the blood on his hands. But the thing about ghosts, they leave trails. Investigators back in Florida weren't fooled by his staged suicide note. From the very beginning, they knew Edward Zakrzewski was alive, and they knew he was running. The case exploded into a national manhunt. The FBI joined forces with U.S. Marshals, tracking every lead, every possible sighting. His face was on wanted posters, in newspapers, on television. The man who once swore an oath to serve his country was now its most wanted fugitive. But Edward's new life in paradise wasn't as simple as he imagined. Isolation began to eat away at him. The guilt, the paranoia, they crept in like shadows at night. At one point, he tried to end it all, attempting suicide in a desperate bid to escape the inevitable. But he failed. And in that failure, something broke inside him. By September of 1994, just 3 months after the murders, Edward Zakrzewski surrendered to authorities in Hawaii. The chase was over. But his fight, the one for his life, was only just beginning. The father who murdered his family was back in chains, waiting for a trial that would decide if he lived or died. After nearly 3 decades on death row, the countdown began. In the final 24 hours of his life, Edward Zakrzewski woke up in his cell at Florida State Prison in Rayford knowing there were no more appeals, no more delays, just the needle waiting at the end of a long, silent hallway. Reports from inside the prison say Edward was calm. No anger, no visible panic. For a man who had spent decades in a cage, perhaps this was the end he had already made peace with. In those last hours, he was allowed what every condemned prisoner receives. Time to speak with spiritual advisors and, if he chose, a final visit from anyone willing to see him. Whether out of shame or by choice, very few names were on his list. Then came the question every death row inmate is asked: what do you want for your last meal? In Florida, there's a cap on cost, $1.40, and the food must come from the prison kitchen. No lobster, no champagne, no extravagance. Edward's choice was simple, almost unremarkable, a standard prison meal. No special requests. No grand gesture. Just another plate of food before the end. As night fell over Rayford, Edward Zakrzewski, once a husband, a father, and a U.S. Air Force veteran, sat in silence, waiting for the door to open. On the evening of his execution, the door to Edward Zakrzewski's cell opened for the last time. 2 guards escorted him down a narrow corridor known among inmates as the Last Mile. It was just after 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison in Rayford. A place where silence speaks louder than chains. He walked calmly, without resistance, into the brightly lit execution chamber. Waiting inside were the witnesses, journalists, officials, and a small number of people who came to watch the state carry out its ultimate sentence. Edward was placed on the gurney, his arms outstretched as if in surrender. Leather straps pinned him down, one across the chest, others around the wrists and ankles, until he could no longer move. The warden stepped forward and asked the question that marks the final moment of life, "Do you have any last words?" Edward did speak, but only briefly. His voice was low, steady, almost detached. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said. "I hope my family can forgive me." No anger. No long speech. Just those words, and then silence. At 6:17 p.m., the first of 3 chemicals flowed into his veins. Within minutes, Edward Zakrzewski, once a soldier, a husband, and a father, was gone. When the news broke that Edward Zakrzewski was dead, reactions were divided. For some, especially those close to Sylvia and the children, this was closure long overdue. 3 lives taken in one night, and for nearly 30 years, justice had waited behind locked doors. Now, it was done. But not everyone saw it that way. Anti-death penalty advocates called the execution another failure of a broken system. They argued that Edward's mental state, his depression, and his decades of isolation should have been enough to spare him the needle. Others raised a different question: should military veterans, men and women who once served their country, be treated differently when they commit crimes as civilians? It's a debate that still has no easy answer. What is certain is this: Florida is no stranger to executions. In 2025 alone, the state has already carried out several, and officials show no sign of slowing down. For those who believe in the ultimate punishment, the system worked as intended. For those who oppose it, Edward Zakrzewski's death was just another reminder that the cycle of violence never really ends. And that is the story of Edward Zakrzewski, a U.S. Air Force veteran who became a family annihilator, and after nearly 30 years on death row, faced the ultimate punishment. From the walls of a Florida home soaked in blood to the sterile chamber where his life ended, this case forces us to ask hard questions about justice, morality, and the price of control. Do you believe justice was served here? Or does taking a life, even in the name of law, make us no different than the killers we condemn? And should the death penalty take a man's military service into account, or does the crime erase every honor he once earned? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop your opinion in the comments, because this conversation doesn't end here. If you want more deep dives into death row, cold cases, and the crimes that shake America, make sure you subscribe to Mr. Cold Case and turn on notifications. We have more stories coming, stories you won't want to miss.